Saint Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431, broke gender boundaries nearly every day of her short life. She was a successful military leader who had mystic visions and was subsequently burned at the stake. Recent scholarship has offered unique trans readings of Joan's life, and some, like M.W. Byczowski, argue that Joan's wearing of masculine clothing and fulfillment of societal roles considered masculine was what culminated in her execution. Byczowski demonstrates that whether or not Joan was transmasculine, Joan's life was constrained by socio-cultural norms that were not only gendered, but virulently transphobic. Joan's death was the direct result of medieval transphobia. New readings on St. Joan of Arc's story prove how useful queer and transgender lenses are at understanding medieval societies. It is not the queer historian's goal to prove Joan as living under a transmasculine identity still not yet defined. However, trans and queer lenses provide useful insight into the gender norms of medieval societies. Medieval historians explore gender and sexuality using queer and transgender lenses to recover non-conforming lives and make them visible. As transgender activist Leslie Feinberg wrote, "I couldn't find myself in history. No one like me seemed to have ever existed."
Decades of blood, sweat, and tears. The freedom to marry is finally the law of the land.
Recovering queer history is essential towards working for transgender rights because society must accept the existence of transgender lives, past and present. I'm Historical Method Man, and this is Lenses, Focus, Fluidity, Lessons from Medieval Queer History. First, we will explore sexual norms and the women who disrupt them. Then, we will learn about gender norms and the people who disrupt them. Finally, we will end with a state of the field to understand how medieval historians are trailblazing in this up-and-coming subfield. To understand how queer sexuality disrupted the norms of medieval society, one must understand the norms of gendered sexuality that are culturally determined instead of biologically shaped. In Gendered Sexuality, classicist and medievalist Joyce E. Salisbury argues that gendered sexuality in the Middle Ages came from Greco-Roman views of male and female sexuality. The most important aspect of this difference lie within a sexual hierarchy. It was perfectly acceptable to be an active partner in a homosexual relationship, since that preserved the all-important gender definition equating activity with masculinity. Oral sexuality with a female partner was much condemned since it too inverted the social hierarchy. It was commonly held within heterosexual bonds that the man had to be the active partner in both his public life and sexual relationships. The Greco-Roman view of sexuality made strong distinctions between active and passive partners, as man's power was a large characteristic of his supposed manliness. The idea of sexual hierarchy opens up many questions about homosexual relationships and sexual activity. Salisbury cites Paul Vine's ideas on homosexuality in classical Rome. The roots of medieval understandings of sexuality. To be active is to be male, whatever the sex of the compliant partner. To take one's pleasure was virile, to accept it servile. Lesbian relationships challenged this sexual hierarchy, but it was not considered as dangerous as male homosexuality. Many male writers, often within the church, found sex without male genitalia hard to imagine. As a result, they often assumed lesbian sex could only exist if women used sexual instruments like dildos. Only then would they be challenging the sexual hierarchy. So, there are many sources on lesbianism coming from canon law. Still, there are fewer sources on lesbian women than gay men. According to Judith M. Bennett, gay men can be traced in legal and religious records before the 20th century. Descriptive sources by philosophers, monks, and diarists were frequently filled with personal stories. However, lesbian histories are even more challenging to construct, for even fewer documents tell of past lesbians among their privileged or ordinary folk. Women wrote less, their writing survived less often, and they were less likely than men to come to the attention of civic and religious authorities. In fact, there are confirmed about 12 lesbian women from the medieval millennium, almost all of whom were imprisoned and executed for their activities in the 1400s. Furthermore, most penitentials overlooked lesbianism in comparison to male homosexuality, potentially because female love disrupted this sexual hierarchy less than same-sex male relationships. Regardless, the knowledge of lesbianism in the Middle Ages comes in part from its disruption of sexual norms. So, the majority of the sources are prescriptive rather than descriptive. In a letter from St. Augustine to a community of nuns around 423 Common Era, Augustine condemns sex and distinguishes between homoerotic activity and homosocial relationships that could be viewed in a more positive light. He declared, "The love between you, however, ought not to be earthly but spiritual. For the things which shameless women do, even to other women, in low jokes and games, are to be avoided not only by widows and chaste handmaids of Christ, living under a holy rule of life, but also entirely by married women and maidens destined for marriage." There was certainly a fear of lesbianism shared by male members within the Catholic Church, for nuns had to be faithful as brides of Christ. Yet, Augustine still made it clear that married and single women outside the church must not engage in lesbian activities. The penitential of Theodore also punished lesbian activity, but they did not have the words to describe lesbian identities, saying, "If a woman practices vice with a woman, she shall do penance for 3 years. If she practices solitary vice, she shall do penance for the same period." Both of these pieces of canonical rhetoric and practice reveals to us that lesbian women existed, but the Middle Ages did not possess the language to describe it. There were not many explicit definitions of lesbianism, especially as an identity. So, these sources reveal that sexuality was defined much more fluidly than today. An interesting prescriptive source on convent life by Donatus, who died in 355 Common Era, shows how some clerics feared that affection would lead to lesbian sexual expression. He declared through a rule on how nuns ought to sleep. Each should sleep in a separate bed, and they should accept bedding according to the arrangements of the couches as the mother directs. If possible, all should sleep in one place. Lights should burn in each candle until daybreak. They should sleep clothed, their girdles bound and always ready for divine service with gravity and modesty. Nuns were to sleep together with a complete lack of privacy, while at the same time they should sleep alone, without an occasion to touch a sister or to see a sister naked. Donatus realized that women could have intimate relationships with each other even if they never delved into sexuality. This is why Judith Bennett's new category of lesbian-like is so essential. Women could have many forms of love with other women, whether they were desirous, sexual, or just in circumstances where they supported and loved other women. There is no simple rubric for lesbianism, so Bennett suggests to apply lesbian definitions onto practices, not persons. Jacqueline Murray agreed with this idea, stating that scholars need a more nuanced understanding of women's relationships, one that encompasses primary emotional, erotic, and social bonds that stop short of genital sexual expression. In these ways, lesbian readings of medieval women reveal more about the society in which they lived, not an identity that was not yet defined. The category of lesbian-like is incredibly important to how medieval historians approach queer sexuality through the documents at hand. Some might think that the use of the word lesbian when referring to the pre-modern era is anachronistic, so lesbian-like offers ways to circumvent the more present phenomenon of lesbian identity and look at the different ways that women could love each other. Whether the understanding of sexuality in medieval society was based on identity or different forms of lesbian love, queer experiences do not need to fit rigid definitions to reaffirm the validity and representation of queer people today. I'm Historical Method Man. Please stay tuned for Part 2, Gender Norms and the People Who Disrupt Them, coming out soon. Thank you very much. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Have a nice day.